I remember walking into a department store in the former east of Germany, and almost immediately, the air just felt different.
Different how?
It wasn't the architecture or the language that struck me. It was the mood. You could feel these, I don't know, these invisible currents of tension running just beneath the simplest interactions.
Right.
I watched this minor misunderstanding at a supermarket checkout, and it just escalated way faster than it should have. A simple question to a clerk was met not with, helpfulness, but with this kind of raw, guarded abruptness.
And you felt that directly.
At first, I took it personally. I really did. I thought, did I say something wrong?
Yeah.
It's just that stereotype of the cold East German playing out.
Yeah.
But as I spent a few more days there, just sort of observing from the sidelines, my perspective shifted completely.
And what did you realize?
I realized what I was seeing wasn't unkindness. It was exhaustion.
Oh.
It was the fatigue of a people who had lived through 44 years of occupation, followed by the humiliation of economic collapse, all without ever really being allowed to grieve. And that's when it hit me.
That it wasn't just about Germany.
Exactly. It was a perfect and really painful example of a universal human mechanism. When a person or an entire society carries too much unprocessed history, that pain doesn't just disappear. It leaks.
And it doesn't look like sadness.
Not at all. It looks like irritation. It looks for a target. It looks for someone smaller or weaker to carry the burden for a while.
That observation that the friction you experienced was historical, not personal, that is the perfect entry point for this deep dive.
Okay.
Our mission today is to examine this precise mechanism, the logic of blame. We're moving beyond, the simple concept of individual fault to look at the massive process of psychological projection.
How it scales up.
How it scales up into huge social dynamics, and how these collective emotional burdens, especially the burdens of unacknowledged trauma or humiliation, are systematically discharged onto specific, vulnerable targets.
Whether that's in ancient rituals, at political rallies, or, all over our modern digital spaces.
Exactly. We're connecting the dots.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of historical pain finding a current target. We are essentially connecting the interior world of shame or rage, these repressed, unowned feelings, to the exterior choices we make about who we choose to hate.
That's a great way to put it. Sound like an invisible pressure gauge, doesn't it?
It does. The pressure has to be released somewhere, and often it's just released onto the path of least resistance.
That's absolutely right. We're dealing with a core defense mechanism that doesn't just protect the individual ego, but it protects the collective ego too, by warping perception.
So the target becomes a kind of vessel.
A psychological vessel for all the anxieties and unacceptable parts of the blaming group. Yeah.
So to really get into this, let's start with the basics. Let's define the core psychological process here. Projection. It's a term we use casually all the time.
We do.
But its formal definition is pretty profound. It is the mental process of attributing one's own unacceptable internal thoughts, beliefs, emotions, or impulses to another person or group.
You're basically taking the internal conflict or the shame and you're casting it outside yourself. You're literally projecting it onto an external screen.
It's the classic, maybe the most foundational psychological defense mechanism.
It is. And the beauty of projection, from the ego's point of view, is that it allows you to retain a sense of moral purity.
Because the problem isn't in me anymore.
Precisely. If you are deeply conflicted over expressing, say, deep-seated rage, projection enables this crucial cognitive shift. You change the terrifying internal statement, I harbor murderous thoughts against them, to the much safer external statement, they harbor murderous thoughts against me.
And then your fear or your outrage feels justified.
Completely justified. It can then be used consciously or unconsciously to justify prejudice, attack, or evade any personal responsibility for those original unacceptable thoughts.
What's fascinating to me is how universal this understanding is. It seems to predate formal psychology by millennia. It's like human beings have always known this pattern instinctively.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a modern invention at all. We see precursors to this idea in wisdom traditions all around the world.
Like where?
The Babylonian Talmud, for instance, written around 500 AD, gives a very direct warning. It says, do not taunt your neighbor with the blemish you yourself have.
That's incredibly direct. A clear caution against placing your own defects onto others.
And of course, most famously, you have the New Testament parable of the mote and the beam.
Right. Jesus asks, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?
And that parable, it goes right to the heart of the matter. It implies that the thing we see most clearly and react to most violently in others is often a repressed or unacceptable quality within ourselves.
A quality that's been made massive.
Massive and impossible to ignore when we place it in the external world. We become hyper-focused on that minor flaw, the mote in the other person, precisely because we're trying to ignore the gigantic, overwhelming flaw, the beam in ourselves.
So Sigmund Freud, he was the one who really formalized this.
He did. He talked about those internal feelings, desires, motivations, feelings that are simply too unacceptable for us to own.
And he saw them as being dealt with by being placed outside, attributed to someone else.
Right. And here's a crucial subtlety that he noted. Projection is rarely an entirely arbitrary fabrication. It's not just made up out of thin air.
What do you mean?
It often seizes upon and exaggerates a small existing element in the target person.
To make the accusation stick.
Exactly. If the target group is, say, perceived as slightly different or slightly wealthier, the projection latches onto that little sliver of truth and just exaggerates it wildly to justify the enormous burden of hate being placed upon them.
And later, Jungian analysts connected this mechanism directly to the shadow archetype.
Yes, the shadow, the dark, unlived, and incompatible aspects of the self. When we see pure evil, Jung argued, we are usually looking at our own unlived shadow projected onto an external figure.
Which is why projection is so potent in fueling not just personal disputes, but huge, large-scale conflicts.
That link to the shadow is absolutely key because it moves us from the individual psyche to the collective body.
The repressed feelings of one person become the historical wounds of an entire population, actively seeking a collective target. That mood of exhaustion I described in East Germany.
That was the psychological pressure cooker starting to hiss.
Exactly.
The post-war experience was devastating for so many people in the East. They didn't just experience reunification, they experienced the humiliation of a life's work being invalidated.
The whole system they had lived under for 40 years just collapsed.
And their factories were often deemed worthless, their regional history erased by this dominant, perceived, superior Western narrative. This created a persistent, powerful collective pain that was never truly mourned or acknowledged by the unified state.
You see this so clearly in the story of a man named Klaus, living in Saxony. He was in his late 60s, and he watched as the True Hand Agency, this body that was responsible for privatizing and, well, often shutting down state enterprises, just dismantled his town's industrial base.
For someone like Klaus, the True Hand wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a destructive, abstract force that stole his dignity and invalidated his entire adult life.
His rage against the system, against the West, against these abstract economic forces, it was decades old and just so deeply rooted.
But abstract rage is unsatisfying, isn't it? It's hard to punch an economic trend.
It is, and this is the pivot point we need to analyze. Years later, Klaus's historical rage, which was previously sort of diffused against these complex, untouchable forces, it found a new, specific, and very visible target.
The vulnerable refugee center opening in his neighborhood.
Exactly.
The journalist who spoke with him observed that Klaus projected all his feelings of being invaded, replaced, and left behind onto families who had just arrived, families who were undeniably weaker and had absolutely nothing to do with the economic collapse he suffered back in the 1990s.
It just highlights the psychological logic of deflection so perfectly. So what does this tell us about the mechanism of collective blame?
It shows us that it's profoundly easier to punch down at a visible, weaker outsider, a newly arrived family, than it is to confront the complex, invisible political and economic forces that actually dismantled your life and caused your pain.
Because those complex forces are too diffuse, too powerful.
And confronting them requires a painful admission of your own powerlessness. The refugee center, however, provides a concrete, localized, and emotionally satisfying outlet.
His anger is completely real, but the target is entirely wrong.
Exactly. And we see here how a profound lack of societal acknowledgement for historical wounds and collective suffering creates a vacuum. It creates a demand for a scapegoat.
That unprocessed pain has to go somewhere.
It has to discharge somewhere, and the external target offers the clearest, easiest route for that energetic release.
This whole mechanism of deflecting frustration onto an unrelated party, this brings us directly to what's known as scapegoat theory.
Right. Scapegoat theory is the sociological explanation for how frustration and aggression get directed at a group that is not the causal agent of the difficulty.
So when social or economic challenges pop up,
people often look for a simple, non-complex explanation, which leads them to unfairly blame a marginalized group for problems they had nothing to do with creating.
This was explored a lot by social psychologists like Gordon Allport back in the mid-20th century, right? Especially through the lens of in-group versus out-group conflict.
Allport's work is crucial here. He argued that scapegoating is most likely when the in-group and the out-group are interdependent, but they lack mutual trust.
So like two groups competing for the same limited resources during an economic downturn.
Exactly. That lack of trust compels one group to blame the other for failures they encounter in the competition. But Allport had a critical insight here.
What was that?
He observed that aggression against an outgroup does not serve a cathartic function. You don't actually feel better after blaming them.
It doesn't solve anything.
No. Instead, the aggression feeds on itself, leading to ever worse intergroup relations. Blaming doesn't resolve the underlying frustration. It just justifies more hostility, creating this vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. So the need for a scapegoat isn't about solving a problem. It's about solving an emotional need. The need to feel righteous and in control.
That's the core of it. And this takes us to the really profound anthropological origins of the concept, which were revived by the French anthropologist René Girard. Girard shifted the discussion from psychology back to ritual. He argued, after studying just vast mythological and historical sources, that human communities maintain social cohesion and prevent total self-destruction through a self-organizing mechanism he called sacrificial scapegoats.
A founding murder.
Yes.
Yeah.
For Girard, societies are constantly on the brink of what he called mimetic crisis, this sort of runaway violence. And this violence is temporarily checked and channeled through the collective ritualistic act of expelling a sacrificial victim.
So this act of founding murder simultaneously defines who's in the us who unites to kill.
And who is out the alien who must be removed.
And the ultimate ancient expression of this whole sacrificial ritual is the Greek practice of the pharmakos. The pharmakos ritual was chillingly pragmatic. When plague or famine or some military misfortune struck a city like Athens, the citizens would choose a symbolic victim.
Who would they choose?
Often someone deemed undesirable, a beggar, a criminal, maybe a physically disfigured person. They would literally load the city's collective sins, its contamination, or its guilt onto this one chosen individual.
And then what?
They'd parade them around, and then they'd subsequently either exile them or, in some of the darker versions of the ritual, kill them.
And the belief was that this purified the community.
That the victim's suffering purified the community, restoring cosmic order. It reveals a chilling truth. When a community feels existential fear or chaos, their instinct is not complex understanding.
It's the search for someone to sacrifice and eliminate.
The genius of the pharmakos ritual is that it allows the community to feel clean again. And that exact ritual is playing out today. We can link this demand for purification directly to the dynamics following modern crises, like the 2008 financial collapse.
Economic crises are modern plagues.
They are. They collapse not just financial markets, but the foundational stories people tell themselves about security, about meritocracy, about progress. And the widespread pain and humiliation from the crash created a perfect breeding ground for anti-immigrant and protectionist sentiment all over the globe.
So let's think about a specific case. Let's call her Sarah. She loses her home to foreclosure after 2008. The trauma was public. Her furniture was literally piled up on the sidewalk for everyone to see.
She would have carried deep, burning shame for years, internalizing this idea that she had failed, even though the system was structurally rotten.
And this deep personal shame is the toxic fuel we're talking about.
And here comes the populist speaker. The speaker doesn't offer a nuanced discussion of banking regulations or systemic risk. No. Instead, they leverage that pain.
They point to them.
Immigrants, global elites, cultural others, and they tell Sarah, you weren't incompetent, you weren't a failure, you were robbed by these outsiders, you are the true victim, and your shame is misplaced.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the populist rally then functions as a psychological, or I guess a religious exorcism.
That's exactly what it is.
By cheering the politician and demonizing the targeted group, that heavy burden of personal shame is just instantly lifted from Sarah's shoulders. It transmutes into a feeling of righteous, justified collective anger.
That transformation is the psychological mechanism of the pharmakos. Sarah is given a purified in-group identity. She is no longer the failed homeowner. She is now the wronged party, the true citizen whose dignity must be restored by expelling the symbolic contamination.
So populist rhetoric thrives by exploiting this massive demand for scapegoats.
A demand created by collective humiliation. It offers the powerful promise of a purified in-group identity through the complete demonization and symbolic sacrifice of an innocent outsider.
So if a society fails to protect its citizens from this kind of profound insecurity, it ensures a constant volatile demand for a ritual of collective blame.
That's the cycle. And to fully understand why this cycle erupts with such intensity and persists over decades, we have to turn to the psychological fuel that ignites it: collective narcissism.
This concept seems fundamental to analyzing modern intergroup conflict.
It is. Collective narcissism is defined as a specific psychological tendency, the need to exaggerate the positive image of one's social group, be it a nation, a political movement, any shared identity, really.
So it's basically group-level entitlement coupled with intense insecurity.
It is, and it's absolutely crucial to draw a clear distinction here. Collective narcissism is not the same as simple patriotism or healthy in-group loyalty.
What's the difference?
Well, healthy patriotism might say, we are a great nation and we want to help others. Collective narcissism says, we are the greatest group, and anyone who questions or disrespects us must be punished.
I see. And it's only modestly correlated with individual narcissism.
That's right. You don't have to be individually self-obsessed to exhibit strong collective narcissistic traits, but it is a remarkably strong predictor of hostile intergroup behaviors and attitudes, precisely because it measures how vulnerable the group identity feels.
And this concept isn't new, is it? It has historical context related to some of the biggest geopolitical disasters of the last century.
It does. Thinkers like Theodore Adorno, working in the aftermath of World War II, theorized that collective narcissism strongly motivated support for Nazi politics in Germany.
Because of the humiliation of World War I.
Exactly. They argued that it was a psychological response to an undermined sense of national self-worth following the humiliation of defeat in World War I and the economic turmoil of the Weimar Republic.
So when the collective greatness is inherently doubted.
When the group feels deeply humiliated, the reaction to perceived threats becomes hyper-aggressive and defensive. This links collective narcissism closely to what we call vulnerable narcissism, which is characterized by underlying insecurity, distrust, and an erotic need for validation.
Okay, so if the group's greatness is fragile, how does that fragility actually manifest in their external relations? It sounds like it mirrors the entitled behavior of an individual narcissist, but just scaled up.
It does. The narcissistic group constantly feels entitled to a level of respect and recognition it believes it is owed.
The constant internal sentiment is, our group is extraordinary and deserves far more, and the only reason we aren't getting it is because they're actively holding us back.
And that intense belief means the narcissistic group operates with a heightened sensitivity.
So they react aggressively not just to actual threats, but to perceived slights. Little things.
Precisely. Collective narcissism strongly predicts aggressive retaliation to past, present, and most importantly, imagined offenses to the in-group. This hypervigilance stems directly from the underlying doubt about the group's actual greatness.
They're constantly feeling threatened.
In intergroup situations that require only the slightest stretch of the imagination to be perceived as insulting or belittling?
Yes. We see this fragility play out in high-stakes international scenarios. I'm thinking of, for example, the reactions of collective narcissists in Turkey toward the European Union.
Yes. The prolonged wait and perceived constant judgment regarding their admission to the European Union was felt as a deep collective humiliation by those with high collective narcissistic tendencies.
So that underlying sense of being unjustly judged.
It translated immediately into hostility toward EU institutions and states, even if those states weren't actively responsible for the delays. The perceived slight is instantly inflated into a massive betrayal requiring aggressive retaliation.
Or the example of Polish collective narcissists reacting to something as seemingly trivial as a celebrity joke about their government.
That case is a perfect illustration. A public figure made a petty joke, but the collective narcissistic response escalated instantly to threatening physical punishment and open rejoicing in the misfortune of the perceived offender.
So the perceived slight isn't viewed as a joke.
No, it's viewed as confirmation that the world refuses to recognize the group's deserved status, and therefore, the world must be fought. This emotional inflation is what makes such groups so dangerous in political contexts.
And that need to externalize blame and distrust, that seems to lead inevitably to conspiracy thinking.
Absolutely. If you believe your group is extraordinary, morally pure, and deserving of reverence, yet you are constantly being disrespected or failing to achieve your goals, you have to conclude that the failure is not internal.
So it must be someone else's fault.
Therefore, Unseen, powerful, secretive forces, a cabal, a deep state, globalists, must be actively working behind the scenes to undermine your deserved status. Collective narcissism is a very strong predictor of conspiracy theorizing.
The belief in an invisible enemy is a psychological shield.
A shield against having to confront the group's own shortcomings, yes.
And this aggressive tendency finds its perfect expression in the charismatic leader-follower relationship, particularly in populist movements.
It's a textbook case of mutual psychological fulfillment. Political psychologists theorize this as an interaction between two distinct types of narcissistic personalities within the group structure.
Even if they aren't clinically narcissistic.
Right. The leader assumes the role of the mirror-hungry personality. They're the figure who needs a continuous, overwhelming flow of admiration and respect from the group to maintain their grand, inflated self-image. Their confidence is often the core product they're selling.
And the followers, they represent the ideal hungry segment.
Yes. These are often individuals like Sarah, who lost her home, who feel they have damaged egos or low personal self-worth. They invest their own personal image and sense of value entirely in the well-being of the group.
They're seeking security and purpose in the leader's confidence.
And reflected glory. The leader provides the idealized vision of the group that the followers themselves cannot internally generate because of their own vulnerabilities. The relationship is symbiotic and relentlessly reinforcing.
The followers give the admiration the leader craves.
And the leader's aggressive confidence validates the followers' feeling that they are part of a truly great yet misunderstood entity.
So essentially, both parties are seeking greater justification to love their group as much as possible, which then requires a corresponding need to hate the outgroup equally as much.
Precisely. The more the leader attacks the external enemy, the more secure the follower feels in their purified identity. They're engaging in a shared psychological project to maintain an insecure identity.
And the more fragile the collective self-esteem.
The stronger the collectively narcissistic sentiments become, and the more violently they demand a scapegoat to carry the burden of their collective fragility.
If the scapegoat ritual is a constant throughout human history, then the digital age has provided it with an unprecedented speed, scale, and emotional velocity.
It has.
So we now turn to cancel culture, a phenomenon that functions disturbingly like a modern ritual of purification, where the mob can form and execute the ritual almost instantly.
The fundamental pattern of eliminating dissent through collective moral judgment is, as we've established, ancient. The execution of Socrates in 399 BCE, convicted for impiety and corrupting the youth, serves as that initial historical prototype.
So it's a formal, systemic eradication of dissent.
And it shares the core structure of today's cancellation, eliminating an individual via collective moral judgment to preserve the perceived purity of the dominant narrative.
But while Socrates faced physical execution, modern cancellation usually results in social death-stripping individuals of honor, of their careers, and their social standing.
Right. But we have to confront the argument that cancel culture must exist. The need for collective moral expression can, at times, feel absolutely necessary.
And proponents argue that it roots in a vital sense of justice. They point to movements like #MeToo, which use collective denunciation to punish abusers who were otherwise protected by formal systems.
And viewed through that lens, canceling can be seen as a necessary ritual of purification that restores moral balance. The argument is that to lose the right to collective moral expression is to lose the right to pursue the highest moral ideals and oppose systemic injustices.
So they would claim this is a sane, voluntary response to immorality, not just clueless mob madness.
Right. But this brings us to the profound paradox.
Which is that protecting the right of the collective to express moral discontent, which is necessary for accountability, simultaneously means protecting a mechanism that often just summarily curtails the liberty and rights of the canceled individual.
That paradox is critical. We can't simply dismiss the demand for justice, but we have to be aware that when this demand is met outside of legitimate formal processes, the inherent risks, dehumanization, intolerance, they just skyrocket.
The necessity is inseparable from its corrosive downside.
Especially when it becomes a ritualistic performance. And when the ritual takes over, the victims of cancellation are often subjected to what's called identity reductionism.
They're reduced to just a symbol of evil, stripped of any human complexity, history, or context.
And this is perhaps the most toxic psychological fallout. An individual's moral character is evaluated solely based on a simplistic, negative identity label like racist, plagiarist, or sexist.
And the public actively participates in this simplification.
Because a simple villain is much more emotionally satisfying than a complex, flawed human being.
The case of Justine Sacco is the classic illustration here. In 2013, she posted a sarcastic tweet to a tiny group of followers that was interpreted in the worst possible way.
Right. Despite her subjective intent being ironic or satirical, she was immediately branded a racist and publicly destroyed. She lost her job, suffered severe psychological distress.
And the crucial insight here is that the mob wasn't really punishing Justine Sacco, the person.
No, they were punishing Justine Sacco, the symbol, a creation of the crowd used for their own ritualistic needs. This identity reductionism undermines any possibility of genuine forgiveness or critical dialogue.
And once that label sticks, redemption becomes pretty much impossible, as we saw with the writer Jonah Lehrer.
Right. Lehrer was exposed for plagiarism and fabrication. Once he was deemed a compulsive plagiarist, everything he subsequently did was scrutinized under suspicion. He was even labeled a sociopath by armchair critics online.
The hostile environment just stifled any room for recovery.
And anything he said or wrote was framed as further proof of his essential corrupted nature. On a collective level, this environment fosters moral coercion, forcing participants to rapidly choose sides based on very limited information, which just intensifies intolerance within the system.
Beyond the psychological damage, the modern cancellation process fails completely when you measure it against any standard of legitimate justice.
Oh, completely. If we look at Lon Fuller's 8 principles of legitimate law, a benchmark for whether a legal or judicial system is functioning justly, cancel culture fails miserably on 2 key fronts.
Okay, what are they?
First, it lacks publicity and clarity. The standard for moral judgment is vague, and it varies radically from person to person, platform to platform, making victims utterly unaware of why they are being condemned.
There's no clear legal code for social media. One person's edgy joke is another's career-ending offense.
Exactly. Justine Sacco had no idea that her one tweet would be the catalyst for her misery. The goalpost moves constantly, creating a system where obedience becomes futile because the rules are impossible to know in advance.
And the second failure.
It routinely fails the principle of non-retroactivity.
Meaning, punishing people now for actions that were acceptable or irrelevant years ago.
Yes, actions committed ages ago, even decades ago, are often dragged into the present and retroactively punished by modern moral standards. The example of the Woody Allen case is often cited here.
Where a legally exhausted case was reopened years later in the court of online opinion.
And he was publicly shamed and ostracized again. When a system lacks clear standards and retroactively punishes, Fuller argued that the result is not justice, but profound illegitimacy and chaos.
The ritual satisfies the mob's emotional need without serving genuine justice.
That's the problem. This inherent contradiction, the demand for necessary moral expression versus the toxic injustice of the method, brings us back to that ancient Greek term, pharmakon.
A substance that is both a cure and a toxin.
Cancel culture is our modern pharmakon. It protects free speech by allowing moral dissent, but it also restricts it by dehumanizing victims and stripping them of their procedural rights.
And the digital environment doesn't just host this ritual, it radically amplifies it.
It does. The speed and reach of social media turbocharge the entire sacrificial mechanism, transforming thousands of isolated anxieties into a single, unified, persecutory force.
I'm thinking of the story of Liam, a non-famous graphic designer whose clumsy joke triggered a massive online pylon. Thousands of strangers, totally disconnected from him, suddenly found a singular, manageable target for their floating anxiety.
And this is the core insight for the digital age. Those thousands of participants weren't primarily outraged by the joke itself. They were feeling anxious about chaotic global issues: climate change, political instability, personal debt.
The destruction of Liam became a digital version of the village stoning.
He served as the vessel for their unaddressed collective frustrations and disappointment. Participating in the outrage gives them a fleeting, powerful sense of moral control in a world that otherwise feels chaotic and uncontrollable.
And the algorithm acts as the high priest in this ritual, making sure the sacrifice is successful.
Precisely. The social media algorithm amplifies the most vitriolic attacks, the most outrage-inducing content, because that generates the highest engagement. It's the digital equivalent of the largest crowd gathered around the sacrificial stone.
It drives the process until the victim is effectively sacrificed.
Doxed, fired, forced into hiding. And once that ritual is complete, the collective anxiety is momentarily quelled, the crowd feels purified, and the mob instantly disperses, ready to look for the next vessel to carry its unresolved psychological burdens.
So the goal isn't to eliminate the capacity for collective moral expression, which can drive vital social change, but to maybe integrate it into a framework that prevents the toxic outcome.
That is the balanced approach suggested by this analysis. We need to integrate these powerful, necessary collective moral sentiments, the need to call out injustice, into a formal, regulated, judicial, or restorative channel.
What would that look like?
It would allow the raw moral outrage to drive necessary social and legal reform, but within a regulated structure that safeguards the rights of the accused, establishes clear standards, and allows for due process.
By providing legitimate channels for moral expression.
We potentially reduce the demand for the chaotic, unjust digital sacrifice.
To find a genuine antidote to this cycle of blame, we have to go deeper into the Jungian framework, focusing on the shadow archetype.
The shadow. This archetype is the repository of everything about ourselves, our instincts, our negative impulses, our weaknesses, that is incompatible with our conscious values.
And this material is repressed.
And inevitably projected onto others, fueling large-scale conflicts. Jung viewed this collective psychological splitting, the projection of all darkness onto the enemy, as the direct cause of war.
He saw World War I and World War II as horrific, graphic examples of this.
He did. He warned that the only way to avoid further global catastrophe was for more people to become conscious of their own shadow material and actively take back those projections off their perceived enemies.
They must bear the resulting tension of opposites within themselves.
That's the phrase. If we universally project the dark, violent opposite onto terrorists or the opposition party, we fail to contribute the necessary psychological work toward peace. The conflict stays external and therefore solvable only through violence.
We see this mechanism used constantly in high-level political rhetoric, which relies on religious or archetypal demonization to buttress power and generate emotional conviction in the base.
Oh, constantly. It simplifies the world into a mythic struggle. Political leaders, especially during periods of crisis, frequently utilize this. Think of Ronald Reagan's famous 1983 speech, where he urged the public to ignore moral equivalence between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and instead focus on the Soviet Union as the evil empire.
That is a powerful archetypal projection of pure evil.
At the global level, yes. The intent is to unify the in-group by defining the out-group as mythically monstrous.
And this language is used across the ideological spectrum, right?
Absolutely. The projection is symmetrical. In 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini stated that America is the great Satan. Similarly, President Bush labeled North Korea, Iraq, and Iran the axis of evil in 2002.
It strips political complexity down to a simple religious dichotomy of good versus evil.
It buttresses the power position of the projector. When Hugo Chavez called George W. Bush the devil at the UN, proclaiming the room still smells of sulfur, he was projecting the unconscious negative archetype, the devil, onto a political adversary to cement his own moral authority with his followers.
And bringing this down to domestic politics, we see politicians leveraging the shadow archetype to unify their base through subtle character assassination.
Yes, because it works. The rhetoric focuses on demonization to generate that emotional conviction. Take Newt Gingrich's 1996 memo, which suggested Republicans use words like traitors, destroy, and sick to describe Democrats.
So if the conscious, idealized Republican values center on loyalty, tradition, and stability,
then traitor is the perfect projected self-portrait of the Republican shadow, the exact antithesis of loyalty. They are accusing the other side of embodying their own group's repressed shortcomings.
And conversely, the left projects the opposite qualities.
Exactly. Look at the negative characterizations of Mitt Romney during the 2012 election. He was painted as lacking empathy, rich and indifferent, plastic, fake.
So if the conscious values of the left often center on compassion and empathy,
then the shadow projection focuses on the opposite, a profound lack of feeling and greedy indifference. The core psychological process is identical across the spectrum.
You exteriorize a cliched negative quality as if it were a problem exclusive to the opposition,
while ignoring that power, greed, and indifference are universal human problems that exist within every single group.
So if the theory is simple, take back your projections, the practice is brutally difficult. It requires us to feel what it's like to embody the very thing we despise.
And that's the source of profound psychological discomfort we usually try to avoid. It is the resistance to that discomfort that maintains the cycle of violence. To force this realization, the unconscious often sends what are called compensatory dreams.
Dreams that shock the conscious mind into awareness.
They show us what we do not know but need to know to balance our conscious life. And they can be terrifying because they shatter our carefully constructed moral boundaries.
We hear about the political activists who viewed Dick Cheney as the embodiment of absolute evil. Darth Cheney, he called him, only to dream he was fishing with him in the same small boat.
Or the sniper, returning from the Gulf War, who dreamt the war was still happening, only for him to look through his crosshairs and see his own brother as the target.
These dreams compensate for those one-sided conscious values.
They force the individual to acknowledge a deep, fundamental identity with the despised enemy.
Perhaps the most dramatic historical example of this is the dream of John Adams, the second U.S. president.
Adams was a man of the Enlightenment, holding this naive faith in rational political discourse. He struggled to reconcile his high ideals with the raw, brutal nature of human political conflict.
And in 1790, he had this dream.
He dreamt he was on a lofty scaffold in Versailles, trying to persuade an innumerable multitude of wild and domestic animals, representing human nature in all its forms, to live under the abstract, rational principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity.
He had a speech prepared and everything.
A long, methodical speech about these ideals, but the moment he began, his ideals collided with reality. Total chaos erupted.
The animals, the shadow aspect of humanity, rejected his rational ideals.
Immediately. The elephant pouted in contempt, the lion roared, the wolf howled, the whale rolled to swallow 20 at a mouthful. The dream climaxed in a scene of absolute carnage.
And Adams, frightened, leaped from the stage.
Tearing his clothes and lacerating his skin from head to foot, he awoke, he said, convinced forever what a fool I had been.
Wow.
This dream compensated for his naive faith and rationalism, forcing him to acknowledge his own unreasonable power shadow and the animalistic, destructive dimension of human nature within himself. The painful realization was that the madness was not outside in the French masses. The madness was within him, lacerating his own skin.
So if confronting the shadow is the starting point, Jung's final profound answer to sociopolitical insanity is the development of the human capacity to think symbolically.
Yes. He wrote that humanity is headed for literal genocide if we cannot work out the way of salvation by a symbolic death.
That is a powerful and challenging concept. The choice is whether destruction and transformation happen concretely in the outer world, literal war and murder, or symbolically within the self, leading to inner renewal.
Right. And what thinking symbolically actually means is recognizing that the devil or the angel is not a person across the border or across the aisle. It is an archetypal image representing an internal state.
You contrast the poet with the fundamentalist.
A poet like Goethe speaks of longing to be burned to death as a process of inner transformation, self-purification, and renewal, a symbolic death. The fundamentalist or the terrorist, however, transforms the outer world into a symbolic world without knowing it.
They take the symbol literally.
And enact literal murder or suicide as raw psychosis, believing they are killing the devil in the form of a human enemy.
Our current political landscape is saturated with these unrealized symbols, angels and devils, and this creates what Jung called a fairy tale landscape.
Exactly. We live in a fairy tale. We project the angel onto our leader and the devil onto the adversary, and we lose the capacity to see complexity, paradox, or shared human flaws.
The antidote requires recognizing and integrating the opposite.
The Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, which symbolizes the assimilation of the shadow. It speaks to the profound alchemical symbolism of eating one's own flesh and drinking one's own blood, recognizing the other in yourself.
So if the projected conflict is to be healed, it has to return into the psyche of the individual, where it began unconsciously.
The individual must recognize and accept the other in himself. The necessary work is internal. Confronting the madness within, enduring the tension of opposites, and choosing reflection before reaction. If we can endure ourselves, if we can accept our own flaws and darkness, how will we be able to violently rend others?
What we have discussed today reveals a frightening consistency across human history, from ancient rituals to modern political rhetoric and digital shaming. Unresolved trauma, economic humiliation, and existential anxiety generate a powerful, constant need to find a single, convenient target.
The dynamic is relentlessly consistent. Unprocessed pain leaks out as irritation or rage, which is then defensively projected onto a vulnerable outsider.
This creates the demand for the scapegoat.
Whether that scapegoat is a beggar in ancient Athens, a refugee in post-communist Germany, the globalist in a populist rally, or an ordinary designer like Liam online, the core mechanism of purification through sacrifice remains our default setting when confronted with chaos or collective shame.
So the ultimate synthesis is that the outside conflict is merely a reflection of the internal imbalance.
And the singular significance of this deep dive lies in recognizing that pattern. As Girard showed, the process of identifying the founding murder, the unconscious reliance on violence and blame to establish order, is the first necessary step toward breaking its hold on our human systems and our self-deception.
The past lives in our gestures.
The question is only what we choose to give our ghosts, a weapon or a mirror.